welcome everyone. And I'm very, very thankful for joining in the first ever podcast that we are going to have by Middle East Insights. I'm the founder of this volunteer-based organization. My name is Dr. Shubhda Chaudhary, and with me, we have Parth Sharma, and I'll be going into his bio in detail. So, Parth, thank you so much for being with us today. And as you know, that the topic of today's conversation is identity politics of the US presidential elections, specifically in the context of collective trauma, displacement in Gaza, West Bank, specifically Palestine. So let me start by asking you the first question, which is that why Palestine? Because trauma, displacement, genocide is happening in many countries or nations as we are speaking right now. It can be South Sudan, Nigeria. Right now, also a very disturbing discourse in Bangladesh. Yemen, specifically, the Zaidi sect in Yemen and the ramifications of the Houthi rebels. So there are many nations, the Kurds, the Druze, the Yazdis. So why Palestine?
I think first I would say that that's a fantastic question because I think it's the nexus of what Palestinian and occupied Palestinian territories represent for the world. It's not the first time that a genocide is happening in the world. This is not the first time that a mass conflict and mass displacement or refugee crisis is also going on. But this is the first time that it's captured by citizen journalists at such a scale where you can sit at your home apart, kilometers apart, and still sort of see in real time the effects of mass casualties and displacement as well. The reason why I think the world is also catching up to now Palestine and specifically Gaza is because of October 7th and now the specific systematic assault that Israel has done, or the state of Israel has done on the people within Gaza, and the Western narrative that has followed that. And specifically the Western narrative, which relates to the US imperial government funding or sort of aiding that genocide and aiding that conflict as well. And as we spoke about, there are conflicts going on in South Sudan, the conflicts going on in Congo, there are populations, just recently in Bangladesh as well. It's not that the world is devoid of these conflicts, it's a nexus point and focal event of how much we are seeing mass media cover up the conflicts in a very self-defense. This is the right of the people to exist there and alienating and othering language. And I think on the historical scale, this is the first time that such a mass dehumanizing effort has been made by Western media to do that to the Palestinian people. I think this, which is why I think Palestinian people and specifically the genocide right now is on a focal point for a lot of people as it connects to a lot of different issues. It's not just the genocide in Palestine, it's also the rights of people in North Africa, in Democratic Republic of Congo, in South Sudan, in Haiti, in the Kanaki Islands, etc. Wherever you see the forces of imperialism take place. It's just that this is the focal point to start the conversation of this sort.
So do you think, for example, now on November 5th, the US elections are going to take place? Though US is a presidential democracy, but the president is not chosen by the people. He's chosen by the electoral, or she is chosen by the electoral. They have not come to they at that now level. By the electoral college. Now, one thing which happened very interesting in this domain was Kamala Harris, who has been officially stated as the first presidential woman nominee from the Democrat Party, was not present when the Israeli Prime Minister went to the Congress. She's also talking about a two-state solution. At the same time, the major funders are George Soros and his son, his 38-year-old son, Alex Soros, who now is engaged with one of the high-ranking officials of the Hillary Clinton administration and is of Indian and Pakistani descent, Huda Abedin, if I'm pronouncing her name right. do you think that this kind of change, if it happens, will make any transition in the American foreign policy?
Mm. That's, I think, a very interesting perspective, because Kamala Harris's decision to not be present when Netanyahu was there was a
Yeah,
good to show her policy in a very slight way, subtle way, that it's different from Biden. Because
yeah,
till now, there's been a homogenization of what Biden has and the perspective of Biden and the support that he's had for the state of Israel. But at the same time, Kamala Harris did that. Her husband also made the statement that she will always support the state of
Parth
Israel.
Sharma.
And that not only will she always support the state of Israel, just a few days before that, she put out a statement condemning the protests which were happening in DC as well, calling them anti-Semitic and calling them anti-national as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
So while there is a subtle difference in her approach towards this, I think the format stays the same. The Democratic Party has always been in that format where they want to show progressive nature of policy, where they want to show progressive identity politics, but they want to focus a lot more on these marginalizations of the identity of their own representatives, but at the same time fuel the same American idea. At the end of the day, Trump's idea is also very similar. Trump also
yeah,
went out to say that Netanyahu should end this conflict as soon as possible. And even for that matter, how different is that from Kamala Harris not sharing that same space as well, right? The idea that comes out is that both of them are calling for an end to that conflict now, 9 months into the genocide that they both are fueling. But neither of them are going to condemn the actions of the state of Israel, which have taken place for over 9 months. They're just subtleties in the way that that representation is going on, which I think a lot of people in the progressive space and a lot of Gen Z voters are also picking up on.
yeah. But the I don't see any kind of difference in foreign policy when it comes to Republicans or Democrats, when it comes to Gaza, West Bank, or Golan Heights, because the presidential campaign itself is a billion-dollar industry,
Hmm.
and the funding and the obligations of getting those fundings, they are very,
Hmm.
uh, very subtle but very strong.
Hmm.
Yet, something which made me also very curious is because it's not the first time that students in US campuses started protesting.
Hmm.
They did that during the time when apartheid South Africa prevailed,
Hmm.
during Vietnam War, which gave us Noam Chomsky and others.
Hmm.
But there was one particular catchphrase by those who were against it that was going viral, and that was that these Gen Z protests in US are not organic. They are funded by Qatar.
Hmm.
What do you have to say for that?
I think one that's just funny to me as again as a young person, primarily because it's again a shift on what and which part of the geography represents protest as well, right?
Right.
When this is the age of technology where these protests and the violations that the students are facing themselves of the human rights are visible to the world. So the propaganda and the idea that this is something related to Qatar, this is very focused on Al Jazeera, that reporters from Al Jazeera got access to those encampments and were able to talk to the students, and no other Western media was allowed, or the students chose to have a vow of silence and not talk about their encampments to Western medias as well, is again a very imperial understanding that protests can only be there when they're funded inorganically, when in fact all the encampments are student-led and grassroots movements, which cost next to nothing. And a lot of encampments, and specifically the ones in college, have actually put out these statements saying that you can see the stuff that we're using is all that we own. There is nothing coming in organically here, and we're all here because we represent that idea as well. For many students who are not from America, are at the threat of deportation, have also been in those encampments saying that
Yeah.
not even from Qatar, we are not from the Middle East, we're from different parts of the world, but yet here we are. So to say that these are inorganic protests is essentially to homogenize the identity and say, see, these are de facto extremists coming from Qatar or coming from the Middle East that we now need to pinpoint and say that they're a threat to American democracy. 17, 18-year-olds in encampments are not funded by the Middle East as much as all the politicians are funded by APAC for the presidential election right now. So that
Yeah.
distinction needs to be made very specifically when we're talking about this as well, right?
Yeah. So APAC is what, Parth? Please let our audience know. I don't know if they know about it.
Well, that's that's a much longer conversation, but I think in a nutshell, I'll tell you that it's an Israeli lobby that funds for pro-Israeli statements and pro-Israeli presidents and essentially foreign policy within American elections. So APAC is a body which funds these spaces. So when you have campaigns, etc., there is money that is required. And like you mentioned, the campaigns and elections in America are a $1 billion industry in themselves.
Yeah.
That funders, and APAC is one of the primary funders. Now, there are
Yeah.
people, Dr. Jill Steen, or independent electives which are coming on saying that, there needs to be a third party which comes in. We're vehemently calling for APAC to be called a non-state actor, that it's not American, it's foreign funded, yet it's not recognized. And why would it be when a monopoly of APAC owns the presidential elections and elections in America in general, right?
Yes, it does. And for a very long time, it has been, instead of just like saying that it is by the state of Israel, I think it's more by the Zionists themselves. Like there's a distinction for the students, I'll tell you, there's a distinction between being a Zionist and being Jewish.
Mm.
A person who is Jewish is religiously adhering to the principles of Judaism, which is one of the oldest religions in the world. And the prophet of Jews was Moses, who was able to free the Jewish slaves or the slaves in Egypt during Pharaoh Ramses' time and cross over the Red Sea, though in his lifetime he was never able to go to the Holy Land.
Mm.
Zionists are those who adopt militant ideology in the name of religion for their own political gains. So, not every Jew would be a Zionist. And not necessarily that every Zionist will be a Jew. For example, Biden himself went ahead and clarified at many platforms that I feel like a Zionist, and that was like a badge of honor, even though Anthony Blinken, I don't know, 30 plus trips he has done up and down trying to mitigate the crisis, but sadly it has not. So, Parth, when you look at, say, for example, now in Gaza, the prediction is that 186,000 people are going to be injured or dead. It is going to create a climate catastrophe in terms of malnutrition, diseases, epidemic. There is no way in which the lives of those in Gaza, though even in the safe zones, and Gaza is not bigger than, for example, those who are in Delhi, it's not bigger than East Delhi or South Delhi. Your entire Israel, Palestine is not bigger than Delhi NCR region, just giving you a geographical idea of the space. So, first, initially, they were asked to move from the North Zone, then Khan Yunis, then to the Rafah border with Egypt. Egypt is not ready to take in the migrants because they believe that it would be in the interest of Israel. How do you think that, what do you think is the future of Gaza? Because there are also talks going on of making it a monarchy. There are talks going off of after the ethnic cleansing is over, because natural gas was discovered near Gaza, exploring it further, creating it as a special economic zone for IMEC, or India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor, and other ports that Israel has. So what do you think is the future of Gaza?
I think this has multiple perspectives, but the one I'll take is right now from the health systems and see that it's not in the future that a public health crisis might happen. Polio virus has already started being discovered in parts of Gaza right now. And even when we're talking about the WHO on 25th itself, I think 2 or 3 days ago, went and did an independent testing of samples to see whether polio virus is back or not. With the Israeli military saying that we're vaccinating the soldiers because we've already seen an impending health crisis. So with the genocide in place, for a lot of people, they think that the first step would be a ceasefire and that solves all the problems. But like you said, it's an ecocide It's an ethnic cleansing of the entire people. 51% of Gaza and West Bank combined are people under the age of 18, the children and adolescents, who are now one of the biggest mass disabled population who are being shifted into these camps, right? So one would be to one understand which policy and where do people stand on this. Like you said, there's so many resources that Gaza also has, which is why the blockade is so important to Israel. But a lot of people think that the two-state solution is a viable option here, where actors in a different way, Hamas or whatever that might be, if the PLO can be given that autonomy over those spaces. But a two-state solution is just not viable when an entire generation has been cleansed from their space. So when we look at the purview of settler colonialism, Israel as a settler colonial state is expanding itself. There are so many images and news coming out of the greater Israel idea, or the idea of the promised
Yeah.
land being farther than in the Levantine region as well, right? So the
Yeah.
idea is what future Gaza holds is specifically in the hands of not just the people there who are protesting, resisting the settler colonialism, but also in the hands of people funding this space. Israel is only able to do this because of the funding that they're receiving and the foreign aid that they're receiving as well. So in the future, looking at historians like Ilan Pape, etc., they've spoken a lot about how decolonization of Israel, based on the sanctions, based on the pressure by the global north, would be a very long-standing process, unlike what happened in South Africa, where people need the relocation, they go back to their spaces, they go back to owning those rights as well. But in the near future, that does not seem possible because of the fact that we're nearly a year into the genocide. And yet we're not looking at Western governments. We're now looking at the UK saying that they'll arrest Netanyahu, but that was not the case 6 months back. So we're still not seeing specifically the US, give in to the idea or stop funding that because it's something that they have. Go back 30 years back from Biden's speech where he says that if Israel was not created, America would create one to own autonomy within the Middle East. So from that purview also, we're looking at a future which may or may not exist for Gaza. And that's the scary part within that space as well. But I think a lot of the two-state solutions come to a point where you think, is it really possible to have a two-state solution between a colonizer and the colonized?
A two-state solution was never possible even on 13th of September 1993 during the Oslo Accords in Norway. It was not possible even then. It's not in my perspective because it's actually just a state right now. What the Arabs, the Armenians, the non-Arabs, because they are Palestinian Jews also, they need is the right to vote, the right to work, the right to life. Two-state solution is something, no matter what kind of peace deal is made between Hamas or Fatah by China, which happened on 14th of July recently, is not going to sustain itself. Also, Hamas itself is like the Frankenstein monster of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. He played a very important role in arming up Hamas so that Fatah can be conquered. My next question to you is, in many of the social movements that happen, women play a very integral role. There are so many theories which talk about temporary change hypothesis or gender reconstruction, in which, in most of the movements, what has happened, as even in Arab uprisings itself, that the protests have maybe started or has the larger percentage of women participants. But once the goal is achieved, women or the other minorities are pushed back. Patriarchy is one very existing norm that is affecting not only Muslim women, but also Jewish women, Christian women, Armenian women, all of the women and other minorities that stay in Palestine. How do you predict would happen to them as the future entails?
I think this is where it's a good distinction to make between populism and identity politics as well, right? On what these movements are sort of referring to. If you look at resistance movements across the world, Latin America for that format, a lot of them have been women-led as well. but they've been sustained, and the women's rights movements are still existing in the grassroots level in multiple of those countries, which are now dismantled due to the US imperial rule as well. Here,
Yeah.
I think the presence of Palestine and Gaza, it goes back to who's running these movements and who's co-opting that, right? The elite co-option, elite capture of these movements is something that we can speak about at great length. That there are a bunch of people, and here I want to bring it back to Kamala Harris as well, and the idea of a brown or a black woman in a presidential position, the
Yeah.
fact that these are the people who will come and liberate everyone else. But that's simply not the case. I think Frank Hampton from the Black Panthers said something very interesting when he was alive, was that without political education is colonialism, not neo-colonialism. That when you just are looking at one person coming and liberating us all, or women having the women being pushed forward as the most marginalized within those spaces, people hold on to those narratives because you look at the disenfranchised, right? When you're even talking about the displacement right now, you say women and children in Gaza. You're not talking about the Palestinian men who have been all homogenized as terrorists or who are still within those concentration camps that were found by different news outlets as well. The idea is the moment those movements are met, here we are far from those movements being met within Palestine and Gaza right now. But if at all they are, that elite co-option would again then disenfranchise those women who were there leading those movements and say, you go back to the idea of patriarchy because we've been co-opted for so long that the movement is now ours. And that's something that we saw a lot happen with the apartheid in South Africa as well,
Yeah.
where the movement was co-opted by elites and co-opted by white people within that space as well in the anti-apartheid movement, who are still living in those areas and still by land share, owning majority land share, even in a post-apartheid South Africa as well. So it's very difficult to predict what would be the case with women. But if you look at just identity politics and the idea of women in center, right? It's again a very interesting choice. Whose narrative is it? For the longest time, and again, going back to America during the civil rights movement and the failed legislation that they had, the whole idea was identity politics around race. And when that did not work out, the jobs, the inflation, the American economy was toppling, they started focusing on poor white people. And identity politics took a shift with poor white people now taking the role, Republicans focusing a lot more on getting the poor white vote to be able to make policy of any sort. Then that shifted towards people with disabilities, veterans, the trauma that the veterans had after the multiple wars that they were sent for. Or it went to the queer community, the Native American community. Then those distinctions as well, right? But most of these spaces are sort of co-opted as a narrative and then they're completely discarded as well. So it's very important to figure out here who is leading those women movements, and are women actually at the forefront of those, or are they smoke shows, smoke screens to say this is what we're trying to push forward? But the moment any sort of resolution is there, you're going to go back to a more patriarchal identity of religion, of minority, and we're going to put you back in that space as well.
Like what we saw in Iran in a
Definitely.
similar sense. But one thing which, when it comes to identity politics, women in itself, or even Palestinian men or Jewish men, or they're not homogeneous,
Hmm.
constants. They're variables in themselves, like variables within variables, and uh, they can be different on so many tribal,
Hmm.
ethnic, class, and many other divisions, education. Very few of them from who are actually women who themselves are leading the
Hmm.
identity politics. That's one particular area of research, that who are they, whose
Hmm.
voices is it counting for. But do you think that Benjamin Netanyahu himself will be able to sustain the entire discourse of protest that is happening in tens of thousands every day in Tel Aviv against him?
But the idea is also, if Netanyahu right now within his own government from the far right, Zionist government is already facing backlash
Yeah,
within space. So his position as the leader for this movement or for the genocidal campaign is already at risk within that space. So the
yeah,
moment you take Benjamin Netanyahu out and replace him with another person, the system stays the same. And that goes back to the idea of, who's leading those campaigns. If the Benjamin Netanyahu is out of the picture, who comes next? Will the Zionist regime or the far right regime within Israel completely go away, or will they still continue their conquest of other occupied territories as well? And that same thing follows within America because they share a very similar imperial
yeah,
ideology, that you can take Trump out. You can take Trump was out, Biden came in. Biden came as a replacement to Trump, and Trump's very loud personality, a very bronzer face. I'm very here for an American idea. We're going to call all immigrants as aliens, and we're going to go on a very nation first movement. Biden came with a very, I'm old, I'm resourceful, but did the same exact things in terms of policy as well, right? The Black Lives Movement matter was such a good example of the fact that there can be anyone in power. You still are going to have the same imperial ideology. And I think specifically, if you look at going back to Barack Obama, right? Identity politics of the American populace as such was completely removed when you saw that you can have a very charming narrative of Barack Obama as the first Black president, but at the same time, he and the drone strikes that he had over the Middle East were the highest
Yeah.
at that point.
And also, there were many, though I don't know how harsh one can be with him because he got out of his tenure alive. Yeah,
Well,
that is, that, that is something which because
yeah.
I'm pretty sure that there would have been many times where he would have rubbed the wrong feathers.
Yep.
And there were promises that he was not able to keep, like closing off the Guantanamo Bay
Mm,
prison and many other, the drone strikes that happened. Also, he was the first American president who was able to use the social media technology. Uh, with in the nascent phase exactly that was the credit that he deserves, and
which now
how he
Kamala Harris
understood.
is
Yeah.
capitalizing over. The social media
Yes.
perspective, the auntification of Kamala Harris to be this very South Asian Black auntie who's here laughing, is making Gen Z memes, is approaching the progressives within America, is what essentially got her the VP position back then in
Yeah.
terms, and which is now her campaign as well, is to pull the progressive vote, which either would have not voted in the elections or would have voted right because of the fact that the Democratic government has let them down over the last 4 years. So even she is monopolizing the social media
She
content. Right?
is.
And
Did you watch that phone call from
yeah,
Obama that was going viral? That
and this is a
congratulations.
class in propaganda to begin with.
Yes.
Media
Yes.
propaganda of the empire to what they show. And that's why I
Yeah.
think when I was speaking about, like when I was even these discussions outside of these platforms, that you can put a black or brown face within imperialism. The issue is imperialism. Like no
Yeah.
one, Kamala Harris would not make a good president. She would make a very good president of America. And that exactly is the issue. That she would
Yeah.
make a very, very good president of America, and replication of American imperialism would happen in spaces like Gaza, etc. So the relationship that she'll share within spaces like factors like Israel, etc., would be there, where international humanitarian law can very conveniently be used and not used based on who is an ally of the United States.
Yes. And the most pressing issue is the recent ruling of the ICJ,
Mm,
which, though they did that in 2004, when they also at that point of time mentioned that the Israeli settlements in West Bank are illegal, again they have done it. But the problem is that none of the rulings of the International Court, Criminal Court, are binding.
mm,
So it doesn't matter that why the entire facade and chutzpah of it,
mm,
and the investment of so much of time, labor, and capital into proceedings and orders which are not binding.
mm.
It doesn't make sense.
And
And yeah,
no, go ahead, go ahead.
and the second is when a foreign prime minister comes to the Congress. So, for example, a foreign prime minister coming to our Indian Parliament, which is like both Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha, and giving an address. Where our prime minister or president is present, not present, or maybe at the back foot. And there are 46 to 53 people getting up, giving him a standing ovation, even though he's a genocidal war criminal. And outside of him, there are so many Jewish protesters who are
Mm,
protesting that what is he doing here? And why is he getting a standing ovation?
mm.
How did you see that context?
That's so interesting. I'll come to this in just a second, but I wanted to mention that spaces like the ICJ and the ICC, right? Historically, you can ask any person from Haiti, you can ask them from Congo, Sudan,
Yeah.
ask them from Nigeria, you can ask them from Yemen, you can ask them from any space which has a very strong Western imperial control even now. And you can see that these rulings or these systems do not matter at all because these systems were created to keep the global South in check. after the Second World War. They were never created to keep the global north or the west countries in check as well. And that binary contradiction that you can have US condemn Russia's
Yeah.
encroachment on Ukraine and constant bombardment of Ukraine, with Vladimir Zelensky being on the cover of Time, having a full media campaign around it, because those spaces are completely against the US, right? And again, Ukraine's position with NATO as well. But the moment you turn it to Israel and Palestine, suddenly it becomes a very complex issue that cannot be broken down into simple binaries of genocide is good or genocide is bad. So here, identity politics is often construed to be just minorities, but that's not the case. I would argue identity politics is also about the white identity. The white identity homogenizing and inviting other white identity to hold positions of power. So when I look at Netanyahu in the Congress and I look at everyone standing and clapping while Rashida Tlaib is sitting there holding the fact that he's a war criminal, that itself is a picture of white identity politics that even Trump is running on. That when he says that I'm here to look at the poor white Americans while Latin people come in, Black people come in and steal jobs, and I'm focusing a lot
And
more on
Asians. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I read it as, again, this is a very funny thing which goes on in my generation, is where they call it the United States of Israel, because of the fact that how can you have a foreign entity hold so much power within your electoral system as well, right?
Yeah.
So when I saw that, I was looking at it in complete shock, but also at the same point in disappointment, knowing very well that the ICJ and the ICC, etc., all these international systems are not there to hold white people in power, in positions of power, accountable. So they're there to show you that the world will sanction, the world will do something, that the world should start doing something, but no tangible action